We're following that breaking news just came out of the Supreme Court, that ruling on the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, commonly known, the justices upholding the subsidies in states that did not establish their own exchanges. This was a major contention by conservatives opposed to that law. Our Scott Thuman is live outside the Supreme Court, ready to provide us his perspective on the reaction there outside the courthouse. Scott?
Yeah, Mike, it's interesting because I had a talk immediately after this case was heard before the Supreme Court, and I talked with who's now the former Healthcare Secretary, Kathleen Sebelius, and she was telling me, look, this is all a matter of semantics, that the right, or those who were against the healthcare law, were really hanging their argument on those four words, established by the state, meaning, in other words, that the federal subsidies could only go to people who had used exchanges that were established by the state. It's only 16 states. So she said clearly in this 900-plus page law that was written across the street by Congress, they didn't intend for it to be so separated. So she said it was all in a technicality. Whether or not that's what convinced the 9 justices, we don't know. I need to read through the entire ruling. But the bottom line is they supported what they would claim is the intent of the law. And had they not, you would have seen perhaps 6 million people instantly who would have lost some sort of federal subsidies. They would have lost some money and then therefore not been able to afford the health care. There were CBO estimates that they might have seen their health care jump by $3,300, something that they could no longer afford because you're talking mostly about lower and middle income families. So you had 16 states that were really kind of safe from losing their subsidies. You had 34 who were in danger of losing them. And I think that the Supreme Court looked at the overall package, the intent of that law is written, and decided that this was the way that they needed to rule.
We should remind our viewers this was a 6-3 decision with Chief Justice John Roberts and Anthony Kennedy joining the more liberal justices on the court. Scott, can you set the scene for us? What was the reaction?
Once an intern ran out and everyone kind of looked at the first ruling, realized that it was indeed King versus Burwell, there was a pretty big eruption from a bunch of ACA supporters, healthcare supporters, Obamacare supporters, as you would call them, who've been gathering here for the past couple of hours. And once again, forgive us for going through the equipment and all the other journalists here, but you'll see those signs, the red and blue signs, and each one represents a state. So, for example, you see AZ, Arizona, they're saying 266,000 still covered. They're talking about the people that would have been affected by this ruling and needed for it to be upheld. Now, here's the thing. You do have a pretty interesting CBO estimate that came out, Mike, that talked about how it actually is adding to the deficit, and that's what the GOP had been holding on to, saying that this is bad in so many ways. But there wasn't a plan B, at least not publicly. And Mike, I know you've reported on this and talked about this. It was very fascinating to watch this Obama administration say, well, there isn't really any plan B. They might have had one behind closed doors and just not wanted to let that out. But we didn't know what was going to happen, other than some Republicans on the Hill said, look, if this rules against the Affordable Care Act, and suddenly you have millions of people who are affected and it hurts their pocketbooks, we're going to come up with some sort of legislation to help ease that and integrate the system with health care and the insurers to kind of lift some of the burden. But had the ruling gone the other way, it would have been very, very interesting to see how many people would have actually been affected and what would have happened across the street on Capitol Hill.
Scholars, journalists, legal experts now parsing through every word of that decision that came down 6-3. Chief Justice Roberts joining Kennedy and the more liberal justices. Scott, let me get your take on that, the numbers, because 6-3, that does send a message about the divide of the court, and more than just 5-4 coming out in this decision upholding the Affordable Care Act. How much does that matter to this ruling, to this White House?
In the end, as long as you get a win, it doesn't matter what the scoreboard tally truly was when it comes from the Supreme Court. But you raise a really good point, because 6-3 is a relatively definitive answer from the 9 behind me. I think here's the argument you're going to see written up in editorials, and it's going to be whether or not the Supreme Court continues to take into consideration public opinion and the shift in our social society and structure, because so many times they say, look, this is all about the law. It's about what we believe is legal and right, constitutional. But there's also this continual seepage of sentiment. Are we doing what's best for people these days? The times have changed. Look, it wasn't terribly long ago that interracial marriage was still outlawed, and that's something that may come into consideration with the other big case we're waiting to hear. But yeah, Mike, I think you raise a good point. These justices, they're normal people too, to some degree. I mean, they're out amongst all of us. They see the rallies, they hear people, they read, they have neighbors, and they're influenced. And there is a significant chance that they have seen that this is a changing of the guard, that the times are changing. And when you look at public opinion polls, and that so many states now are in favor of one measure over another, that has to play some sort of factor. May not be overwhelming, but it has to be part of their psyche. But for those on the far right who have been against this from day one, yeah, they'll continue to argue that, but it somewhat becomes a moot point.
Scott Thuman live with us at the Supreme Court. I know you have a job to do. You want to get reaction from folks out there. Eliana, if we could continue our conversation, 6.4 million people were in the crosshairs, in the balance of this decision, and now they know they will maintain their health care coverage under the Affordable Care Act, all based on 4 words in this piece of legislation, now law. And you have to think that members of Congress who supported this law, even opponents of the law, are going to be extra careful when they put together the next major piece of legislation and double and triple and maybe for 10 times check the language to make sure that there's no opening like this to get through an entire legal procedure going to the Supreme Court.
Well, one would hope, right? But I don't know that the history of the way government works suggests that they don't make the same mistake twice.
So ultimately, when we look back at this decision, is this going to just be seen as a technicality that was dismissed in a 6-3 ruling, or will we look at this decision as important as the first major Affordable Care Act ruling, where again we saw Chief Justice Roberts side with the liberal justices?
Oh, I think both will be seen as monumental, and history will see Chief Justice Roberts as the black-robed person who essentially upheld this law, ensured it stayed in place, and absolutely both will be seen as monumental.